Hi there. I'm Olivia Mattis, delighted to welcome you today on behalf of the Sousa Mendez Foundation. We honor a hero of the Holocaust, a rescuer, Aristides de Sousa Mendez, who in 1940 risked everything to save thousands of people that he didn't even know. Sound familiar? That's also the story we're telling today, the story of Chiune Sugihara, who did pretty much the same thing, but in Lithuania. And we have a very exciting program ahead for you today. I hope you had a chance to see the film. We have one of the stars of that film. Her name is Dr. Sylvia SMOLLER. She is a professor emerita at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. She was not only in this film, she was also in the Michael King film, The Rescuers, and she personally was rescued by Chiune Sugihara. She's here to tell you her story. Before she does, we have our featured author, and that's Richard Horowitz, author of this fabulous book, In the Garden of the Righteous, which we are offering for sale. We're going to put the link in the chat box for how to get your own copy of Richard's book. It's going to be signed and inscribed, so you'll just tell us how you want it inscribed, and Richard will be happy to oblige. So Richard has been a moderator on several of our programs. We also co-sponsored an event he gave last week at the 92nd Street Y, which was very exciting. And our third speaker is not live with us. She's Madoka Sugihara. Because of the time difference between New York and Japan, 14 hours, we pre-recorded the conversation between herself and Richard Horowitz. Very interesting conversation. That conversation was translated by the filmmaker Chelin Gluck, to whom I am extremely grateful. He also edited the video to present what you're going to see, which has the English subtitles. And we're happy to take questions for Madoka as well. Just make sure when you type your questions into the chat box, if you have a question for Madoka, that you add your email address so that we'll know how to get those answers back to you. So you all will remain muted, but you'll have, I'm sure, lots of questions. So do be typing those questions in. Richard will be serving as the moderator today, and he'll be addressing your questions when it's that time of the program. So without further ado, Richard, please take it away.
Thank you, Olivia. It's a great pleasure to be here. Welcome everybody this afternoon. As Olivia mentioned, I've written a book on rescuers, which includes a chapter both on Sousa Mendez and on Sugihara. And I wanted to thank you, Olivia, for all of your partnership with the book and with the mission of bringing attention to these very amazing people. So today we're going to celebrate and learn about Sugihara. And his story, as Olivia mentioned, is in some ways very similar to Aristides de Sousa Mendez. So he was also a diplomat, and his activity actually took place on the other side of Europe in Lithuania. So I'll give you a little bit of background about Sugihara. So he was born actually January 1900, so the first day of the century, which is something he was actually quite proud of his entire life. And he was born into a Japan that under the Emperor Meiji was in the process of modernizing. And so, there's an interesting image I like from when he was younger, is they said that he was wearing sort of his Japanese kimono as a child while he was playing American baseball. So, but he was somebody who was from a very early age very interested in other countries and the world outside of Japan, which was fairly unusual for a Japanese man of his generation. He was a polyglot. He spoke many languages fluently. He had a love for languages early on in his life. And actually, this may sound familiar to a number of people. His father wanted him to be a doctor, and he did not want to be a doctor. He wanted to study languages. And so he actually intentionally flunked the medical exam, which led to an entire intervention from his mother to patch things up with the father. But in any event, he ended up using his language skills to join the foreign ministry. And for many years, he was a Russia hand. So Russia was the single most important foreign nation for Japan. strategically. And so he was an extraordinarily important person because of his language and cultural skills. And he was based in, among other places, Harbin, which is I used to call it Little St. Petersburg. It's a city in the kind of border of the Soviet Union and China, and it was where he encountered not only a lot of Russians, but some Jews as well. He actually married a woman who was Russian, although they ended up divorced. And he was intimately involved with the negotiations with the Russians over the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Um, a little known fact, I think, is that he was also an intelligence officer. And this is what I believe sent him to Lithuania, where the Japanese government opened a consulate in a place where no Japanese people ever visited, which is in Kaunas in Lithuania. And it was done because the Japanese military believed that the Russians and the Germans would eventually fall out. This proved to be true, but Sugihara was sent there to monitor troop movements. He reported directly to the foreign ministry, and his son, who's you'll hear from that son's daughter, that son who was 5 years old, Hiroki, remembered his father on picnics, like sort of looking at different counting troop movements and vehicles, et cetera. So this is where the Sugihara family in 1940, in the summer of 1940, and you see there Sugihara and his wife Yukiko with their three children, three boys. Then there's her sister who was there as well, and the man in the back was a German Nazi party member who ended up becoming quite heroic in this rescue effort that I'm about to explain. So in 1940, as the Russians and the Germans were bearing down, a lot of German refugees were pouring into Lithuania looking to get out of Europe. And one day, they looked out the window at the consulate, and which had been under orders to be shut down at this point, actually, because the Russians wanted all consulates shut down because they were incorporating Lithuania into the Soviet Union. At that point, they looked out the window and they saw, if you could flip the slide, this picture, which was taken by Sugihara's sister-in-law. And these are just a very long line of desperate refugees who were, begging to get out, for visas out. A number of them, not all of them, but a number of them had gotten visas from a Dutch diplomat, a businessman actually, who was an acting consul, to the island of Curacao. But what you needed was an exit visa, and then Sugihara, the Japanese, the idea was that they would give you a transit visa that would allow you, if you had to transit through Japan, and more importantly, the only way out at this point was east through the Soviet Union. So you had to go to Japan. And again, in a sort of eerily similar moment to Sousa Mendes, Sugihara met with five representatives, young people of the refugees, and they asked him to please write them visas so they could escape. And he 3 times cabled Tokyo for permission to do this, and 3 times he was declined. And then he decided, again, like Sousa Mendes, he would do this anyway. And so he then went into sort of a frenzy over a period of time when they were putting enormous pressure on him to shut down the consulate, where he wrote as many as 2,000 visas. Many of these were used by families, including Sylvia, who you'll hear from. And as you can see, it was in Japanese. It was almost a calligraphic script. So there are stories about how Sugihara's hand literally was sort of like freezing up as he was writing these visas day and night. He even wrote them when he was finally had to leave from the hotel, and then even on the train, he was still writing visas for people. And there were, when you think about, many of the people he rescued were very religious. The only yeshiva, the Mir yeshiva, to survive intact was entirely due to Sugihara, which probably single-handedly frustrated Heinrich Himmler's project to destroy this Talmudic scholarship. They were very worried that this would happen in the United States. It's exactly what did happen. So he also probably arranged then for travel, given his Russian contacts on the Trans-Siberian Railroad, all the way east to the Sea of Japan. And then you heard in the movie about some of the other wonderful Japanese people who helped the refugees get to Japan. After the war, again, I wanted to say, actually, many of the people who gave testimony about meeting Sugihara during this found him to be extraordinarily gracious and kind, and people commented on sort of this demeanor that he had and his ability and desire to put everyone at ease. And there's just amazing scenes that people recounted. After the war, he, like Sousa Mendes, had a difficult time. He was interned by the Russians for 18 months as an enemy, and then he was transported on this Trans-Siberian Railroad back to Japan, where he was fired by the Japanese Foreign Ministry for disobeying orders. If this sounds familiar, he had to go door to door selling light bulbs to support his family. His sister-in-law passed away. His youngest child died. He eventually found work as a translator, and he had to go to work in Russia. Unlike Sugihara in 1968, I'm sorry, unlike Sousa Mendes, he was actually found by some of the people who was rescued and was honored. He lived into his 80s, and so in the mid 80s, he actually lived to see himself made a righteous in his final days. But he wasn't rehabilitated until after that as a full ambassador with an apology from the Japanese government, and now he is, of course, a national hero in Japan. So, again, an amazing story of somebody who found themselves in a very difficult position with the ability to help and did so at great peril and paid a great price for it, but has saved literally thousands of people. And I never ceases to amaze me. I still, to this day, will meet new people that I know who were rescued by Sugihara. One quick thing I just wanted to mention, just as a historical interest, is that we've talked today a lot about Japan and the Jews. The Japanese had sort of a very interesting view of the Jewish people. There was a very, very small community in Japan, but they had sort of almost a reverse kind of anti-Semitism that went back to the Russo-Japanese War when Jacob Schiff of Kuhn Loeb had financed. It was the first time the Japanese government placed bonds on the international market. The Jewish banks basically financed half of the expenditures of the Russo-Japanese War, which was a great upset. I mean, nobody expected the Japanese would beat the Russians, and it was partly because of the tremendous pogroms going on in Russia at the time against Jews that the Jews in diaspora supported the Japanese. The Japanese always remembered this, so they had this very fond view of the Jews and also viewed them as very effective and powerful, and it kind of bordered on some conspiracy theories. So they had developed this interesting fugu plan, which is named after the delicacy fish that's highly poisonous if you get too close to it, to actually bring Jews into Manchuria to colonize, to basically develop it. They had this plan that was sort of, in the end, upended by the war. But they had this kind of deep respect and almost, like kind of fear for Jews and their capabilities. But again, ordinary Japanese also were extraordinarily welcoming to the Jews, and many of the refugees who transited with Sugihara or elsewhere through Japan commented on that. So I think that's a little bit of a background on Sugihara. I would now like to turn this over to my new friend Sylvia, who I've gotten to know the last few weeks, and we met at my talk last week, who is herself directly received a visa from Sugihara to share her thoughts as well. So Sylvia, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for this opportunity to tell the story of my escape from the Holocaust, enabled by the courage of Chiune Sugihara. First, I want to give you a little background. My mother was born in a small town called Żarki, near Poland, near Warsaw, rather. And she always wanted to get out of that small town and live in a big city. And she had that opportunity when she married my father, and they moved to Warsaw. My father was an official in the Polish government in the Ministry of Interior, and he was the first and only Jew in the Polish government at that time. He was the representative of the Polish minorities, which included the Ukrainians and the Jews. I was born in Warsaw and had a pleasant early childhood. Okay, so this is a picture of my father, my mother, and me in Poland. Very happy. And Warsaw was a very lovely city to live in until September 1st, 1939, when the Nazis invaded Poland and the Second World War began. In a short time, the Nazis occupied Warsaw, and it had been bombed severely before they entered Warsaw. It was in ruins. A day after the invasion of Poland, the Nazis occupied Żarki, the town that my mother was born in and where her family still lived. Within a year or two, of course, they occupied most of Europe, and they developed a plan to exterminate the Jews. How did they manage to implement a plan for mass murder in so many different countries? They had a system of intimidation and fear, and also rewards for those who cooperated with them. I make this point because it all started slowly with small indignities until it culminated in the Holocaust. I want to show you this picture. It's my aunt and uncle getting married in 1940 in Żarki, which was occupied by the Nazis. My grandmother's in the middle. Note how happy they look, totally unaware of the horrible things that were about to happen. But my uncle is wearing an armband with a Star of David on it to identify him as Jewish. All Jews were required to wear it. One might say that's a small indignity, but such indignities, like labeling people by their religion, for example, if ignored and allowed to continue, may lead to large tragedies. A week or so after the bombings started, my father, mother, and I fled Warsaw. We escaped by train, by car, by freight train, by horse-drawn cart, any way that we could, as we made our way through the small towns and country villages of Poland, sometimes fleeing in the middle of the night, sometimes just the three of us, but more often with a small group of refugees. We were going eastward, away from the advancing German army. We kept moving eastward till we arrived in Vilnius now. This was our last stop. We could go no further unless we had a visa to another country. At that time, the United States and other countries did not want to let the Jews in. In America, there were very strict quotas for the number of people who could get visas, and we were trapped. And it was in this historical context that Consul Sugihara was the Japanese consul in Kovno, now known as Kaunas, Lithuania, in August of 1940. Japan was not yet an official ally of Germany, but was preparing to become one formally. The Japanese consulate was one of only two opened in Kaunas in early August, since the Russians had ordered the closing of the other foreign consulates as part of their pact with Germany. Sugihara, so he was our only hope for survival, and we needed to get a visa to get out of this trap. He gave a transit visa to Japan to a Dutch student, as Richard talked about, who said he was going to Curacao, a Dutch colony in the Caribbean. Soon word got out, and many Jews gathered at the consulate asking for visas to Japan. And of course, most of them had no destination other than Japan. And it is likely that Sugihara knew that. In any case, he didn't ask. Sugihara wired Japan for permission to issue these visas, but was refused. And more Jews, as Richard showed before, gathered outside the consulate. He wired Japan again. He was again refused, and he decided to do it anyway because he knew that we would face certain death. And so he acted on the dictates of his conscience. Chiune Sugihara gave about 2,000 such visas, each one for a whole family. Ours was visa 459. That's my father's name, Alexander Haftka. And this is my family's passport that included my mother and me, with the signed visa there. You can see my name is on the left-hand side here, and on the right is the signed Sugihara visa. There were about 6,000 people who were saved in this way by Sugihara, and it's estimated there are now up to 100,000 descendants of these people. After we got the visa, we traveled to Moscow, where my parents were granted a special destination visa to the US by President Roosevelt, who issued several hundred of these special visas. From Moscow, we took the Trans-Siberian Railroad for 10 nights and 11 days, and we traveled across Siberia to the port of Vladivostok. And from there, we took a 2-day boat trip on a very rough sea to Japan. I was proud because I think I was the only one on that ship who was not seasick. And that was a point of accomplishment. We arrived in the port of Tsuruga, Japan in December on a very cold day. And after a week or so, we moved to Kobe, where most of the Jewish refugees were, and the Jewish agency there supported us. We stayed in a hotel in Kobe, and the Japanese were very kind to us, actually. They took us on sightseeing trips. And this is a photograph of my family together with some friends of my parents when we visited Kiyomizu Temple in Kyoto. You can see me in the front and my mother next to me, my father in back, and some friends of theirs. Eventually, we sailed from Yokohama to Seattle on the Hiyamaru, a freighter that took some passengers. And from there, we took the cross-country train to New York, and my life in America began. So this was our journey, took us around the world, from all the way across Siberia to Japan, across the Pacific Ocean to Seattle, and eventually to New York. My parents struggled to make a living in America, but they, especially my father, placed a very great value in education. And eventually I went on to earn a doctorate, though unfortunately my father did not live to see that, which is really sad. In 1993, I donated my father's passport at a science symposium to the mayor of Yaotsu, Sugihara's birthplace, for a planned Sugihara museum there, which was at that time not yet built. In the year 2000, I had the honor of meeting Mrs. Sugihara and of being part of the ribbon cutting ceremony for the Sugihara Museum, where the passport is now on display. In case anyone wants to visit, it's a beautiful place. This slide, next slide, on the right shows my son, daughter-in-law, granddaughter, and me when we visited Kiyomizu Temple in 2016. And on the left, you see the slide I showed before of my parents and me, who were at the same spot in 1941. And you can imagine what a thrill it was for me emotionally to be there with my family so many years after I was there as a child. And Chiune Sugihara made this miracle possible. I have written a historical novel that tells this story and the story of life before, during, and after these events took place. It is titled Chance and Consequence, a historical novel of life, love, and World War II. So this is the butterfly effect. You know, when seemingly small events have a far-reaching consequence across time and space, with unforeseen consequences. And I marvel at the far-reaching consequences of Sugihara's courageous act. An example of this butterfly effect. When he saved my life, he also saved my then unborn son's life and all that he now contributes to the world. Now multiply this by the close to 100,000 descendants of the Sugihara survivors, and consider how many scholars, artists, doctors, lawyers, scientists, musicians, statesmen, craftsmen Consul Sugihara saved. It's really quite astounding. But the endlessly fascinating question is, why did Sugihara do what he did? Simply because he believed it was the right thing to do. Well, it was his character. He was quite simply a decent man. Character develops slowly, small choice by small choice, and the accumulation of many small decencies over a lifetime defines us and defines Sugihara. Another important point is that small indecencies lead to big indecencies, and they must be stopped when they occur. The Holocaust began with small and then larger and larger indignities. I want to end this talk by saying just one more thing. I believe it's my duty to speak out about the dangerous turn America and the many countries in Europe are taking in our times, any chance I get. Going after and suppressing scientists, universities, government agencies, the press, the judiciary, targeting people who are vulnerable, all this is on the path to disaster. So what can we ordinary people do or not do to stop that dangerous progression toward the point of no return? It's a small thing, but for one thing, I think we must not avoid talking to people we disagree with, even though it may be much easier to avoid it. Instead, we must speak out, and I am happy I had this chance to tell my story. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sylvia. And Richard, why don't you now introduce your conversation with Madoka? I think you need to unmute yourself.
I recently had the opportunity to talk to Madoka Sugihara, who is the granddaughter of the consul. She's the daughter of his oldest child, who was also an eyewitness there at the age of 5. And she knew her grandfather quite well, so we had an opportunity to talk about what he was like as a person, how he thought about what he did, and some of the details that happened on the ground. So we're pleased to now share the video of that, which was translated. Thank you, Madoka. It's a great honor to speak to you. And I think everyone listening to this is a huge admirer of your grandfather and of what he did. And it's wonderful to meet you, and you should be very proud of the legacy. One thing, having studied a lot of rescuers, including, Aristides de Souza Mendes and your grandfather, that I think is always interesting when you speak to family members is maybe if you could tell us a little bit about what he was like as a grandparent and as a parent, and how old were you? Like, did you know him well, and anything you can tell us about him, your memories of him as a person.
私は特に祖父が晩年の祖父しか知らないんですけれども、リトアニアのことについては実は祖父から何も聞いていません。祖母からそのリトアニアについては聞いています。人柄といえば非常に几帳面な人で、人に思いやりのある人、それから人が困ったことを絶対見過ごせないで、必ず人を助けることをしていた人だというふうに思っています。で、実際、祖父の周りの人たちからそういう話をたくさん聞いています。
Could you maybe lay out for us how you're related to your grandfather and the names of your grandmother and then your father and everyone who was sort of around the events?
My grandfather's name is Chiune Sugihara, and my grandma is Yukiko Sugihara. Chiune and Yukiko had 4 boys. First is my father, his name is Hiroki, and the second is Chiaki, and the third boy is Haruki. He born in Lithuania, but he came back to Japan. He died 12 years old. And the last boy is alive in Belgium. His name is Nobuki. And me is Hiroki and Michi's child. Hiroki had 2 children, me and my oldest brother, Chihiro. And I have 2 children now, and boy and girl.
Given that your grandfather was a polyglot, what language or languages did he use to communicate with the refugees in Lithuania?
He spoke to just only English, and he spoke German, Russian, and Chinese, and Korean. 彼喋るときにドイツ語でリトアニア系ドイツ人と喋っていて、その人たちがポーランド語を訳してたから直接には話したい。一人通訳を入れてました。
Did you see him a lot as a child?
私が19歳の時に祖父が亡くなったんですけれども、子供の頃は本当によく祖父と山荘があったのですけれども、そういうところで過ごしたり、それから祖父の家にしょっちゅう毎月遊びに行ったりして、時間を多く過ごしていました。
You mentioned your grandmother spoke more about what happened. What was her view of the events and, why your grandfather did what he did, and anything particularly stay with you from her recollection?
私は祖父が亡くなった後に祖母が本を書いて、それから講演をしたんですね。で、その講演している場所に何度も一緒にいますし、子供の時にそのヨーロッパから持ち帰った写真がたくさんあったので、その写真を見ながら話を実はよく聞いていました。
Do you remember when he was given the righteous among the nations honor by Israel?
祖父が85歳の時に、ヤドバシム賞をもらったんですけれども、もうその時はベッドに寝たきりで、実は祖父は日本のイスラエル大使館で受け取りに行ったのは、私のおばあちゃんと私の父と、それから母の3人で行ったんですよ。なので、祖父がそこの場所に実はいたわけじゃないんです。たった1回だけ祖父が83歳ぐらいの時に、私がまだ高校生だったんですけど、日本のユダヤ教会に呼ばれて、シャミール首相が来るというので、家族全員で行ったことがたった1回だけあります。祖父が本当にギリギリ、やっと歩けるような状態で、ほとんど耳も聞こえなかったんですけど、
I'm curious, whether your various members of your family, I understand your grandfather didn't talk about it, but why do you think and why did they think that he did what he did in Lithuania?
理由の一つとしては、彼が自分が思った正しいことを、それが普通に人間として当たり前のことだったからしたんだっていうことが非常に単純な理由だと思います。二つ目としては、私に最後死ぬときに僕はクリスチャンだからって言ったんですね。祖母の本を読むと、私がビザを書かなかったら、この人たちはもう命がないだろう。私はこれをしなければ神に背くっていうふうに祖母に話したんですね。ものすごい信仰が深い人ではなかったんですけれども、クリスチャンでしたし、それが理由の一つだというふうに思っています。あと、学校の教育、ハルピン学院で受けた時の3つの言葉があるんですけれども、人を助けるようにっていう訓示みたいな言葉があって、でそれも多分彼が前に突き進むだけのその原動力になったのではないかというふうに思います。
Do you think that his interest in other cultures and his fluency in other languages, what he learned at Harbin and also in his time overseas, made him look at people differently than if he had not had that experience?
ハルピンの時にユダヤ人と付き合いがあったんですよね。要するにロシア革命で逃れてきた、ロシア系のユダヤ人の人が多分たくさんいらっしゃったんですよね。その時に彼らのそういう文化とか背景をよく分かってたと思います。あと、世界的なその流れに関しても非常に語学ができたので、情報収集能力は優れていたというふうに思います。
I'm curious, given the forgive me for saying it, but sort of the mistreatment of your grandfather by the foreign ministry and the difficult time that he had after the war. What is your thinking, and what was sort of his and your grandmother's thinking, in later times when he ended up being recognized? Did he feel that was was he more at peace with what had happened, or how did he sort of think about the post-war period? Particularly the sort of difficult times you went through working in Russia, et cetera.
祖父から直接そういうことも聞いていないんですけれども、祖母の口から言わせれば、認められたということは非常に彼としては良かったこと。彼自身も非常にそれは間違ったことじゃなかったということを確信しているだろうというふうに家族では言っていましたね。で、何よりも祖母がやっぱり一番納得したというか、2000年に日本の外務省から名誉回復の謝罪があったので、それでやっぱり私たちがやっていることは間違っていなかったんだっていうふうに。
Well, before I guess one question I have is there's different recollections of what happened from different members of your family, and I'm just curious if there's anything in the story that we don't know, or whether, I mean, one thing I've always been interested in is I've heard many different tellings of whether he actually wrote the visas on the train. Is there anything out there that's either not correct exactly, or that you can shed any light on any of the details that are sort of debated?
ビザをね、必死になって駅で書いてるっていうのを、実はそのシカゴに行った時に、家族でずっとそれを世代を超えて話をしていまして、で、その話っていうのは事実だってことが分かったんです。事実じゃないって言ってる人もいますけれども、駅で必死になって祖父がビザを書いてるのを私のおじいちゃんがそこにいて見てたって言ってました。講演会で必ず祖母が話をしたんですけれども、これは本には書いてないんですが、リトアニアの領事館で、それを閉鎖した後に、ホテルに 3、4日間滞在するんですけれども、そのホテルから、最後に、リトアニアから次の赴任地に向かうために、そこにもユダヤ人の人たちがたくさん来て、祖父があまりにも疲れて寝入ってしまった時に、一人だけユダヤ人がドアをノックして、祖母が祖父を起こしたんですけど、起きなくて、で、たった1枚だけ祖父の筆跡を真似て祖母がビザを書いたそうです。それをね、その人が助かったかなってずっと祖母が言ってたんです。
One last question like that is, in the various memoirs that, there's the moment at the beginning when some of the representatives of the people outside of the gate come to talk to your grandfather. And I was curious, like, what you know about sort of his decision-making process and sort of how quickly he decided to start writing the visas for the refugees outside the gate.
祖父が実は当時のことを手記にして晩年に書いていますけれども、たくさんのユダヤ人が詰めかけて、でそこで5人の代表を自分たちで選んで出してもらって、で話を聞いています。でその彼らの困ってその窮状を聞いて、祖父がこれはビザを発給しなければいけないっていう方向に向かっていったことがまず一つです。もう一つの理由としては、祖父が門の前に出て行った時に、一人の年取った女性が近づいてきて、彼の靴にキスをして、こういう祈るような格好で祖父を見て、私の命をお助けくださいって頼んだそうです。それで祖父はこの人たちにビザを書かないわけにはいかないと、心に決めた瞬間だったっていうふうに晩年話をしています。それは私ではなく、祖父が貿易会社に勤めていた時の人に話をした。
How is your grandfather thought of today in Japan?
祖父はですね、学校の教科書にかなりなっていまして、で、小学校の高学年と中学校の教科書、あとは大学受験の問題とか、歴史の教科書にも多く出て、一般書籍も相当出てまして、あともう一つの要因は、私が去年 NHK に出たことが、かなり認知度が上がりまして、本当に多くの日本人がよく知っています。
My last question is, I guess it's in two parts, which is what do you think your grandfather would want his legacy to be? And what do you think his legacy should be?
祖父が自分でしたことっていうのは、自分で責任を取るつもりで全うしてますけれども、日本国内で批判されるっていうことは多分辛かったことだと思うんですよね。でも先々、祖父が残している言葉として、歴史が審判してくれるだろう。僕は間違ったことはしてないっていうふうに信じて絶対疑わなかったと思います。それは自分自身の生きている誇りであり、証であったんじゃないかなっていうふうに思います。それから祖父がサバイバーに向かって残している言葉ですけれども、ユダヤ人を前にしたときに、私はどんな民族でも助けますって言ったんです。で、もう一度同じことがあったとしても、祖父は同じことをするだろうっていうふうにも言葉を残しています。今いろんなふうにその平和っていうものが揺らいでいる時代で、私が今いろんなところで中学生とか高校生に話をしてるんですけども、祖父がしたことっていう正しいこと、自分の両親に対して、自分の心に対して正しいことをしなくてはいけないっていうことを常に思っててほしい。どんな小さなことでもいいから、人に対していい気持ち、優しい気持ち、親切な気持ちを持って、人に助けることができるときには助けてあげてほしい。そういう子になってほしいっていうふうに思って、祖父が一つのモデルケースとして私は話をしていて、それが彼らの一つの道に、先に見える明かり、灯火、示すような、その目標になって生きていってほしいと思って、私は今活動していて、祖父がそれが私たち家族に残されたお金では財産ではないけれども、大事な私たちの受け継ぐべき遺産だと思って皆さんに伝えています。
Great. Well, thank you, Madoka. It's a great pleasure and honor to meet you. And thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts about your amazing grandfather.
Great. So my thanks once again to Chelin Gluck for all of his translation and editing work, and of course to Richard for asking those very insightful questions. So audience members, type those questions into the chat box for Richard, for Sylvia, or for Madoka, and we will get to them in just a few minutes. Right now, I'm taking the floor back to tell you a little bit about what we have upcoming here at the Sousa Mendes Foundation. So we have two very important and exciting programs coming up. on April 6th and May 4th. But actually, before I talk to you about those programs, I want to once again mention that we have this fabulous book, signed and inscribed, available for you. Our intern Emil is going to put the link into the chat box for you to order the book. And also after today's program, there will be an email sent to you with that link as well. So the two programs we have coming up are really fascinating films and really important stories. So on April 6th, we are telling the story of a group of British and Irish women. They were known as the 35s. These are women who in the 1980s started the whole movement to rescue, maybe they started actually in the 70s, to rescue the refuseniks of Russia, the Soviet Jews who were refused permission to emigrate. They were initially, there was this movement to raise awareness of their plight that started in the British Isles and then ultimately spread to the United States and became a huge movement. But our film and our program focus on this early group called the 35s. We have one of them herself, who is now living in Israel. She at the time was the wife of the chief rabbi of Ireland, and she's joining us live from Israel. We have a woman who was herself rescued by this group, the 35s, and we have the filmmaker. It's going to be a very, very important program. Please sign up. You will not regret it. And we'll show you the trailer in a little bit for that program. The next program is after the holidays. So on May 4th is our next program. And there we're turning back to another Japanese hero, this time a Japanese American hero. His name was Fred Korematsu. And what did Fred Korematsu do? He defied the orders of the Roosevelt administration to be interned as a Japanese American. He was born in the United States. He was an American citizen. He said, I did nothing wrong. Why should I be arrested and interned? He said, the Constitution applies equally to me. And he took his case, he sued the US government, took his case all the way to the Supreme Court and lost. The Supreme Court ruled against him. He then lived as, with a criminal record, basically, because he was not only interned, but also jailed. So his civil rights were taken away in all kinds of ways for decades, until finally in the 1980s, he was vindicated. His case was reopened. And on that occasion, he was the one who won the restitution for all Japanese Americans who had been interned. It was Fred Korematsu who won that victory for all of the people who were in his same predicament. And then 10 years later, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. So this is really a breathtaking story of one person displaying moral courage, and he is a true American hero. So right now we want to play the little trailer for the film. It's called Iron Ladies, and it's about this group called the 35s.
At that time, 1970s, early 1980s, people thought of Jews who wanted to immigrate. They regarded them as traitors.
She was my sister. Two KGB people came to our house. They found a taping machine that she was taping all the Hebrew, and that's it. It was enough. They took her to prison.
My friend Barbara, who lived just up the road, said, we've got to do something about it. As I said, what could I do with 4 kids in the bath?
We were 35-year-olds who were holding a hunger strike for a 35-year-old Jewess in prison in the Soviet Union.
The idea was a picture tells 1,000 stories, and when we had these wonderful pictures, people read about it.
We were a bunch of housewives, so that made us unique.
We called the press time and time and time again.
They said, more or less, go home and bake cakes, but in a nicer way.
Until one of the people answering said, oh, it's those 35s again. And we got a name.
The following morning, somebody got a call to say that Asa Palatnik's parents had been allowed to see her in prison.
Well, we couldn't stop. To be really effective, we had to get under the teeth of the Soviet government.
These women were a force.
We tried to stay within the law, but we were probably on the edge.
No one could control them. You could advise them, sure.
It started off with a few of us and grew, and then into Europe.
The Irish were wonderful, partly because of the Blarney.
We were able to emulate what they were doing and do it here.
There was I in my striped pyjamas and my bathing hat, marching up and down with my placard, 9 months pregnant.
Behind those thick walls, we knew that there are people fighting.
If not this group of 35 women, we all will be dead.
We were told to tell nobody. We had names and addresses. We were told under no circumstances to use taxis.
All the rooms were bugged. I hid the names and addresses in a face powder case in the hope that they would not be discovered.
I have a unique experience in my life when you're taken straight from hell to paradise in one day.
Natan Sharansky called for a demonstration of 400,000 people. At that exact moment, Gorbachev was meeting with Reagan, and Reagan said, "Mr. Gorbachev, there are 500,000 American citizens that are asking me to raise the issue of Jewish immigration from the Soviet Union."
I came out of that organization a changed woman.
It was inspirational. It was a very, very important part of our lives.
Actually, it was quite boring until the 35s came along.
So that is just a breathtaking story, and I do hope you'll all sign up. So Richard, please moderate the Q&A.
Yes, I think, Olivia, there's a bunch of chatter about Jan Schwarzendyk, so I think you have a demand for an event about him, it seems like from the chat. So I mean, one thing I just wanted to note, Sylvia, is when you put the map up in your talk about your journey, it actually in some ways mirrors Sugihara's journey, because he was not allowed at the beginning to go through the Soviet Union because of his suspected kind of espionage. And so he actually also went in the other direction from Seattle to New York and then on to Europe and then back through. So he almost did the reverse of what you did. There's a couple of questions for you about why it was that your family got a special visa from FDR, and what were those visas and how many of them were given?
You know, there are a number of lists that FDR signed, and some of them have been made well known in the rescue of the artists like Chagall and it was Bingham, Harry Bingham, and someone else very well known who
Varian Fry.
Varian Fry, thank you. So he had a list of people who were artists and musicians and that he wanted to save because of their cultural backgrounds. There was another list of people that were sort of repositories of Jewish learning or of intellectual life or whatever. And so I think the Mir Yeshiva was on that list. And my father was on that list because he had been a historian and a journalist. He was in the Polish government, and he was not religious. He was acculturated, but he had a very strong Jewish identity. And so I think he got on that list. I think it was a list of about 700 people. I have been trying to find that list. If anyone knows how to get it, I would love to have it. The list that Varian Fry used, that is available publicly.
Yes. Well, thank you. There's a few questions about the Jews of Japan in general. I mean, I'll answer a little bit of this, which is there's a question of what happened to the Jews of Japan after Pearl Harbor. We were talking about that earlier. So there were the very small Jewish community that Sylvia mentioned in Kobe, who were, residents in Japan. And then there were many of the Jews who were transiting through Japan, eventually went to Shanghai, which was a free city and also under Japanese administration. We were chatting earlier, there's an entire separate set of Jews who were trapped in the Philippines, who were German Jews, had been brought there by the United States. And then when the Japanese conquered it, they actually were they were let free because they were technically citizens of Germany and had swastikas in their passports, whereas American and Allied Jews that were living there were actually imprisoned. So it was a very complicated set of events. But again, there were very few Jews to begin with in Japan. I'm not sure, so other people may know, whether I don't believe they were actually impacted by Pearl Harbor in terms of their residency, but most of the other Jews went through Shanghai and then on to the United States or Israel and some other places, or they transited directly. I guess, Sylvia, what was you?
I think most of them really got out before Pearl Harbor, but there were a group of Jews who were transported to Shanghai, I guess just before the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And in Shanghai, they, many of them died of typhus, but many others also did very well and became quite wealthy, actually. But many died of typhus because there was a very strong ghetto there. And typhus was a very important killer of people in that ghetto. My uncle and aunt were in Shanghai, but they did not go through Japan. They got there directly from Russia.
So there are a bunch of questions about, why people like Sugihara did this. I mean, I've spent a lot of time thinking about that, and somebody was asking, was it from his early childhood? And that is, a very important, I think, part of why people did this. There's also a question, I think, for Madoka about Confucianism. I just will note that Sugihara actually had converted to Russian Orthodox Christianity when he had been married the first time, and his wife also Yukiko was also converted, and he often talked about that as being an inspiration for him. But I don't know if you have any thoughts, Sylvia, as to why was there anything in particular that you think made him the decent person he was?
Decency used to be a standard that we in America had. We're losing a sense of. You remember that famous thing in the McCarthy hearings? I think it was Senator Wells who said, "Where is your decency?" I guess maybe Christianity had a lot to do with it. Maybe the samurai code. I think a lot of has been written about the fact that he was a subscriber to the code of samurai. But as I said before, and I think I might have said in my talk, it doesn't come out instantly. I mean, there are two kinds of heroes. A person passes a burning building and sees a child in a window and rushes in without thinking about it. That is an amazing kind of heroism. And then there's the heroes that have to think about it and weigh what the consequences might be. And I guess that was Sugihara. However, it didn't come in a vacuum. So I think that he'd led a life where he started out with very small decencies, and these decencies became a part of his character. So he acted within his character, but it's a mystery. I mean, it's a mystery because if I think, for instance, would I have risen to the occasion? How far would I have gone to protect my son and my family? It's very tough. I think it's just incredible that he did this, and it serves as an amazing role model.
Sylvia, do you have any recollection at the time of what was going on with Sugihara and your family?
I didn't find out about it really until I was an adult and had my own child, and a friend gave me a book called The Fugu Plan by Rabbi Marvin Tokayer, and I read it and I said, oh, this is the story of our journey. And that's when I think when people first started talking about it. It was really not known about for many, many years.
Yes.
I mean, I have some childhood recollections of the journey, if you think of what you remember from at the time you were 6 or 7, there are some very strong memories, but I did not meet Sugihara that I know of.
So maybe it's time for some final thoughts. So Sylvia, what would you like to leave in closing to our audience?
Well, I think I've said my final thoughts. I am really torn, but no longer torn, because I've decided that at every opportunity I have, I'm going to try to speak out against the indecencies and try to particularly talk to young people about these rescuers being models. Hopefully they would never have to face such decisions, but they do face decisions every day in their lives of whether to do the right thing or not. And it'd be nice to get into the habit of doing the right thing. I actually, well, it's too long, but I have for another time, I have a nice story to tell.
Tell it. We have time.
Okay, if you have time, I will tell you. I have a partner now who's British, and he comes to visit very often. And one day we were walking on Lexington Avenue, and you can enter my building either through the back through the garage, or around the block through the front. And as we were on the corner, there was a woman lying on the sidewalk. She was a Black woman, and over her there was a man, a white man, very big, someone you would not want to meet in an alley, bending over him. And my first instinct, shamefully, was, well, let's go in through the back. And my partners didn't even look. He said, oh, I'm going to go over, see if I can help him get her up. And he just rushed over and helped that man get this woman up. She was drunk, and they were homeless and so on. So to develop that kind of instinct where you do it, because it's part of you, is really an admirable and wonderful thing. And I aspire to do that.
Good. What a nice word to end on. Richard, take it away.
Yeah, I would just add to echo what Sylvia has been saying about the importance today. So I think everyone on this call, by the fact that you're on it, believes it's important to remember, out of gratitude, people like Sugihara and Susan Mendez. But I think we live in a time right now where we're unfortunately seeing some of the consequences of a culture that is sort of really accelerated into self-absorption and selfishness. And I think it's who we value and who we choose to celebrate says a lot for us. And I think at this moment, it's very important for all of us, and particularly young people, to have role models, and for us to take the time to talk about people like Sugihara, who did the right thing at the worst moment in history, and who, therefore actually had a huge positive impact on the world. So I think the work is very, very, very important. And I think the rescuers, if there's since the war, probably never been as important a time as now to focus on them.
And Sugihara was sent there to do espionage, and suddenly he's rescuing people. So that's remarkable. And Raoul Wallenberg, probably the same thing, was probably sent to Budapest for some espionage mission and then ends up saving a whole bunch of people. So that to me is just fascinating, how suddenly you're acting out somebody else's mission, but then you choose your own mission.
Yeah.
And of course, we can each make our own choices in life, can't we? So once again, we have this book. Please order it. We have a limited number of copies. Richard will inscribe them to you personally, or to your children or your grandchildren or your neighbor or whoever you want. Please buy the book. Sign up for our next programs. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to Chalanglak once again, and Madoka from afar in Japan. Thank you, Madoka, and our audience. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody. Be well. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.